So yesterday we talked about what the law can and cannot do. We talked about soft conflict of interest and whether or not it's going to be worthwhile for the law to interfere with that, or it might create backlash. Today, we will go deeper and talk about some of the indirect ways in which the law operates and more nuanced look on what the law can and cannot do and how it influences behavior. And we're going to start with a fantastic paper from Yuval and Yotam.
Okay, great, thanks. So I should share the screen, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So you have 15 minutes, and I'll let you know 3 minutes in.
Okay, great. So thanks for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here. I think this is my probably first conference back since the pandemic, so it's really nice to be in a room full of people. And in this paper, we're talking about the preference change in behavioral ethics. Can states create ethical people? And there are many, many different ways to consider this question, but we start from a very specific direction. We start with the law and economics literature on preference change, because this is celebrating the literature and scholarship of Bob Kuta, and he made a very important contribution to this area, and we kind of want to see how we can maybe add something to that. So you probably have different perspectives on the question, but we start from a very, very specific place. So that's the law and econ literature on preference change. So I'll just start with a very short presentation about that, and then I'll move on to present kind of our intervention of, okay, so we have this literature, but maybe we should consider behavioral ethics in this framework. And I'll explain that, and then moving forward just in terms of, okay, so once we've done that, how does that change the literature? How should we think about this question? So that's just in terms of the overview. And when we look at this literature, basically we start with a very, very classic assumption regarding the stability of preferences and classic deterrence theory. So the stability of preferences means that people just have their preferences, and those are determined. We don't know how they're created. We don't really care, and they're just there. And then what we can do is walk mainly around them. So if I have a preference for a discriminatory practice, I might discriminate people. That's a given. We can't really change that. What we might do is offer a sanction, and if I enter the sanction into my decision-making process, maybe I will not discriminate. That's the starting point. And what this literature does is introduce preference change. So what if preference can actually change, and people can change what they want to see in the world? And that's very interesting for lawyer economists, because then we can maybe use the law to change preferences. So let's start with a very simple example, which I will use throughout. We have an HR person, she's going through CVs, and she has a discriminatory preference. She prefers one type of people over a different type of people. If we can change that preference, that will seem to be great. Problem will just go away. We don't need deterrence. We don't need constant enforcement. The problem will go away, and if we can do that, we'll just have better outcomes. So that's in a gist what the literature says. Obviously, it's an oversimplification, but what the literature does do is keep this within a rational framework. So once we change the preference, it will be translated to behavior, and if now I do not have this discriminatory preference, so this will work well. I will simply stop discriminating. And that's the assumption that we are not so sure about, which is, I guess, not very surprising in this. So as an alternative, we introduce the idea, obviously, of bounded ethicality and say, well, let's say we now convince this HR person that discrimination is bad and she no longer has this preference. Does this really tell us that this change in preference will translate into a change in behavior? And that depends. So it could be that beforehand, the reason she was discriminating was not that she had a preference in the sense of a rational decision-making process. She preferred one type of people over another. It might be that a lot of other stuff is going on, right? So it might be that this is just an implicit habit of some sort of implicit judgment. And if this is the case, it is not as clear that once we change the preference, this immediately translates into a change in behavior. So basically what this tells us is that if we consider decision-making processes in this framework, what we're looking for is improving ethical deliberations, which might be different from improving or changing preferences for the better. And that's a slightly different picture. So what I want to do in the main part of the presentation is say, okay, so what does that tell us? Why does this matter, and how does this affect the literature? What would we expect to see moving forward? So a first notion, I think, for these people in this room is ethical nudges. Ethical nudging. Okay, if the HR person is discriminating, but not because of an implicit preference, not as a result of a rational decision-making process, but as an implicit habit or kind of an implicit bias. So what we could do is nudge her in the right direction, right? We could encourage her to take more time to think about what she's doing. We can find all these little ways to push her in the right direction. And that might work in some situations, and I think we do see this done. Our point in this context is that is not preference change. Exactly. It's not that we took her decision-making apparatus, the way she works, and changed that. We're pushing her from the outside, and we might get different outcomes, but it's not preference change. It's something very different. So we sort of put that aside. And then the question is, can we actually improve ethical deliberations? Can we actually help in that? So can we make the HR person on her own, without being nudged on specific occasions, make better ethical decisions? And then the question is more complicated because of several reasons. So first, stability of implicit judgments. If the reason the HR person is discriminating is not that she explicitly prefers one type of people over the other, but that she has an implicit habit, or that she fails to translate her egalitarian preferences to egalitarian choices, that might be more difficult to change compared to her explicit judgment. So you might be able to convince me that people of a certain group are just as effective and useful employees as any other, and I should not discriminate. And maybe I'll accept your position, but I might still discriminate as a result of implicit judgments I keep making, and those can be a lot more stable. It's not as clear that those are easy to change in the same way, right? You can convince someone of a new position, but they might sort of drift back to the original position in their behavior. So that's the first point. And in a very similar way, if I do prefer now not to discriminate, it might also trigger all these mechanisms that help me keep seeing myself as a good person. So if I now think discrimination is bad, that could just make me a lot more hesitant to admit, even to myself, that I am discriminating. The worse the behavior is, the more mechanisms I will use to try and protect myself from appearing to be engaging in that type of behavior. And in a similar fashion, if we think that wrongdoing is often situational, that also tells us that improving ethicality, improving ethical deliberations is more difficult. The reason is that if wrongdoing is situational, meaning that what drives wrongdoing, the sources of wrongdoing are not necessarily personal, but situational factors, that are these ethical blind spots, ethical traps where people, perhaps a great majority of people, will have a tendency to behave in a way that's not necessarily ethical. So by changing preferences, it's not clear that we're doing the right thing. It's not clear that that's the best way to affect behavior. So if we're looking at what this points us towards, that's the problem of re-education. What we should probably be thinking about is some form of training. So it's not that we want to change preferences in the sense that I now do not, in a very explicit level, I'm not looking to discriminate. I no longer prefer one group of people over another, but that I am better aware and better able to actually translate those preferences to decision making, and that requires some form of training. I don't want to say re-education. So we can think about an example. So we can think about an example. So sure, we all have those training sessions that the university sends us, and I think that's something worth considering for a second, because we call them training. So we have sexual harassment training, but the question is that really training? So it's training by name, but I don't think that goes deep enough to be actually considered training. I don't think that that's what people, that people going through that form of training actually experience a change in their ability to conduct candid ethical deliberations. They're introduced to some new information. We don't know how deep it goes in terms of actually changing decision-making capabilities, and that I think helps point the problem. So the problem is that it is not clear that the law is able to engage closely enough with these habits. That's just an old metaphor. Sorry. We're just not sure that the law is able to engage with people's ethical decision making in a direct enough fashion to be able to do what amounts to training in this sense of actually changing your ability to conduct ethical deliberations, which is very different from preference change in the way it's introduced in the literature, in the sense that I will give you new information and then you will simply update your preferences and the problem is solved. And therefore, what we point out is the role of organizations. That's the main move forward, in the sense that it might be that the law does not need to directly engage with people's preferences or with people's ethical deliberations or with decision-making processes, because it is not able to effectively do that. And what the law can do is work indirectly through organizations. So if an organization is sanctioned when the members of the organizations do something the law thinks is bad, and if some form of an improvement of ethical deliberations is the right thing to do and an effective solution, the organization will initiate that type of thing. It's not that the law can directly do it, but institutions, perhaps schools, perhaps corporations, might be more effective players to facilitate this type of change because they have closer engagement with people decision-making processes and with what might account to training in the sense we're looking at, in the sense of improving ethical deliberations. So if the law can impose sanctions on organizations, maybe that will incentivize them in turn to engage with people. And then it means basically that the laws almost never worry directly about preference change. It might be happening in the background through institutional actors that operate in the shadow of the law and might be able to do it, but it's not clear to us that the law is able and should engage with those activities. And I think a useful comparison, and with that I will end, is religious legal systems that are very much engaged with these practices, with these habits of helping people avoid temptation, of helping people be more morally aware. I think that is something that religious legal systems are actively engaged. They think about those things. I don't know if we can debate on how effective they are, but they definitely do try. And we're not so sure that the law in a liberal state is and should be engaged with that types of efforts. So just to sum up the point very briefly, so the effort of preference change is different, we think, from what it is presented in at least this very, very specific literature on the economic analysis of preference change. And once it is considered in a more behavioral framework, the project is seen in a different light, and I think some doubts emerge.
Yes. In a minute. Yeah, 1 minute left. So I don't know if there is anyone in the chat already asking questions, but I'm going to take the first step. So I'm going to play sort of the devil advocate here or something like that, saying what do we really want to change people's preferences in the sense that where is the border between being some sort of mind police that are trying to influence, just like, I don't know, something would say religions, as you mentioned. And is it really something that could create some slippery slope and should really care about people's preferences, or maybe as legal scholars, we should hear more about behavior?
Thanks. So I think that's a very useful question, and I think it kind of it goes to more details about our sort of intervention and the way we think the literature should reconsider things, because the law and economics literature on preference change sort of assumes that this might be legitimate in many cases because all we're doing is introducing people with new information, and if that is enough to change their preferences, so that's not very strong intervention, and we're fine, and we shouldn't worry about the slippery slope because what we're doing is very local, very delicate. It's kind of the minimum, the minimal legal action possible. And I think that what we see after we consider all this is that it is not necessarily so simple, and to facilitate preference change in this sense, once you understand you have to move implicit judgment and you have to move habits, you require a much, much deeper engagement. And I think it really highlights exactly what you're saying, that this is a lot more. Yeah. So I think it just shows, I think my intuition is that you're right. And in that sense, the literature might want to reconsider some of these.
Yes.
2 points. One, I wasn't sure what the relationship between the first set of arguments in which you argued that preference change is doomed to fail, and the second part in which you said organizations will do the job. I'm not sure that why shouldn't they fail the same way? That's one point. The second point is that I'm not sure that you have to change people's implicit bias in order to make them behave decently. I don't remember the details, but I think that in the context of judicial decision-making, you see the judges do have implicit ethnic biases, and still they're able to make judgments that do not show those biases. So it is possible, so it seems, for people to be to carry all those implicit biases and still behave decently, and that's what we care about, don't we?
Okay, so I think for the first point, yeah, I think the problems remain. I just think that in terms of the possible level and intensity of engagement, it is more likely that organizations will be able to overcome some of these problems compared to law. The problem is big. I don't think organizations can completely solve it. I don't think people think that either. But I think they have a better potential, at least. Yeah, I completely agree that the problems remain, and I'm not very optimistic about organizations. I think that, if anything, we should probably be looking then. In that sense, it's a suggestion for reorientation of this literature, right? It's not so much that if you read those papers, it seems like, direct legal order from the legislator or maybe a judge, and we'll have simply better solutions. That is too easy. How far can we get with organizations? Hopefully a bit further. I'm not sure all the way. So that's the first point, and thank you for that clarification. And second, absolutely, I think in many cases you can keep your biases and discriminatory practices, and still, if you're trained, for instance, as a judge, and if you're aware, you can bypass them. But that is very different than simply have a change in preference and then no longer discriminate. And there are many other cases in which we do see implicit biases affect behavior directly. So I think the HR person is an interesting example. And it's not that it's impossible to have HR people that don't discriminate, but we do see many, if we look at this specific literature, we do see many cases where implicit biases have a major role in this specific example, right, of going through CVs.
So I think we have 2 questions. We have the 2 minutes. So we'll have
almost there.
Yeah, over. So Holger first, and then
Oh, sure,
Jennifer,
it's
and
your
then if you don't mind answering both of them one after that.
Where is it?
Okay, sure.
Where is it?
Yeah. I'll try to make it quick. I mean, I think what you have is really two papers in one. One is a paper about the psychology and, what happens when you go through these training programs and so on, and can you change, can you not change? And the other one is just a generic argument about the distribution of authority in a regulatory system. And you're basically saying, hey, look, if we have access to an intermediate level of the hierarchy, in this case, the organization, we can just set the right incentives for them and then they will do the right thing. That's sort of generic. It happens in all regulation. And of course, there's arguments against that, but I just think that those are really separate issues. And I wonder, whether you are well advised to lump them together in one paper.
Jennifer?
Am I now?
Yeah.
Okay. Very nice to be here. It's such an interesting paper. I wonder whether your argument really needs the claim that the law changes preferences. I mean, I know why you did this since we were both part of this symposium on does the law change preferences. But as you know, Lewis and I took the position that it doesn't change preferences, that the law can have the expressive function you're talking about without actually changing underlying preferences. And my sense is that you don't need the law to change preferences in order to make your points relating to expressive law, which I only point out because it relates to the first comment about, well, would we want to do any of this? Is it too paternalistic? And you don't need to have an argument that's vulnerable to that comment, because if the law is changing behavior through norms, or as Holger said, changing information, that's not paternalistic. And so you could avoid that counter argument to some of what you were saying.
No, I think I can only agree with both comments. I think that a lot of this does go back to the point that we want to say something about this specific literature, but yeah, sure, this can travel to many other points in many other areas, as people here have said and shown. So I think that's right.
I just want to connect it to Michal's work, and we talked about it throughout the year. So Michal about the ESG and the millennials, and we talked about it a lot. And Michal, I think, argument was in a similar way to Kutter, was that you cannot fake it, right? So if you're a manager, a CEO in a company that invests in environmental or in being for diversity, it has to be an internal change. And just in a way to connect between the days, I wonder, do people think this is indeed the case? I mean, can't really people fake it in the sense that, okay, now I see that everyone is for the environment, everyone want to be very into diversity. Is it really an empirical argument that people cannot behave in a certain way, which seems to be everyone likes that, and I want to have good reputation. And Kutter also had this argument that Pareto self-improvement is the whole idea is that there's no way for you to fake your altruistic or moral behavior without changing your, but I'm not sure what's the.
Or you can say that things work differently with individuals and organizations, right? So Don was talking yesterday about internal promotion tournaments. So it could be that the people that get to the top level positions are good actors, right? They're narcissists, they have good self-promotion skills, they're good at politics and whatever, right? And organizations have these PR departments that are better at massaging the truth. So it works differently with individuals. If there's a lot of money to be made from appearing to be ESG friendly, then you can very easily appear to be ESG friendly without doing any internal changes.
Right, so you think it's not necessarily.
Not at all.
I'll just follow up. It's not that I think that you cannot fake it. I think that what we think is that since the demand now is pretty sophisticated from the young people, and they are good in tracing things, you're probably going to do better in this industry competition if you will internalize this but for other reasons, because you have more information, because you'll be better knowing what's the next thing that's going to be. Because if you don't, you might find yourself as the person who, who continues singing when everyone else stops, because the young people just understand better, so they know how to kind of identify and expose it. They have more. So,
Right.
but yes.
But this needs to be proved.
No, I agree.
I mean,
it wasn't. It wasn't.
Just to
You didn't
defend
make this argument. Yeah.
I just think he does say that it is only kind of with your nearest and dearest and within a very close community, there you cannot cheat. So just to defend his argument, you can cheat everyone, but maybe not your, maybe not your wife, but I don't know.
Empirical evidence.
Just to
I don't know how to get it, but
Good upbringing. Holger, do you want to repeat the points that you've just made in the chat? About information?
I'm not sure it requires elaboration. I mean, I was just confused by the terminology, because in economics, we tend to think of preferences and information as very separate things. And so I wasn't quite sure what you're talking about when you mentioned that.
Yeah.
Okay, so just in terms of Ariel Porat and Bob Kuta, so they introduced this idea, and the idea is that, let's say I prefer one type of employee over a different type of employee, so that is a preference. And if you provide me with new information that shows me that those people are just as effective, I might change my preference and no longer prefer different kinds of people over them. That's the way it appears in the literature. Obviously, it doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't. It is kind of its own language in a sense.
Information can also have experience, right? If you work with people, you experience them, you get new information about how they are, and then you might change your preference according to that.
Right. So Kuta has this idea, right? So high order preference and low order preferences. So you might say that what you refer to as preferences are high order preferences, and those don't change, and maybe that will be more in line with the way we usually think about those things.
Any more questions?
Maybe one question. In some sense, it's really built on Eyal's question regarding like, why do we think that the organizations will be able to do where the individual failed? Yeah, why? What is it in an organization? And in some sense, I think Jennifer and Lewis's paper goes into the other direction, right? Because they say the fact, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jennifer, in some sense that your paper is exactly in contrast. They say the fact that there is an organization, there's like this decoupling of responsibility and actual functioning. So that the same thing that happens in the individual level may be exacerbated in the organizational level. It means the same kind of biases and your input into correcting it will be lower in our organization than, because it's not you, then right, Jennifer, what do you think is that my interpretation as your paper, as in some sense in contrast to this paper? Would you?
Actually, I see our papers as sympathetic in the sense that we locate, or we're locating the key institution that you have to enlist to alter people's behavior. I won't say preferences because we have a separate paper saying none of this is altering preferences. Has to be the organization, because the organization is the key arbiter of whether, well, I'm not going to repeat the presentation I'm about to give. So we're simpatico with them in that we say the organization is the key institution who you have to influence. I think where we may be slightly different is we start out saying under the law as it currently exists in most countries, since most countries have very narrow corporate criminal liability rules, organizations have incentives to have employees engage in misconduct and therefore are leaning the other way as long as misconduct is profitable. And they're leaning effectively the other way.
So as long as we don't have liability on our organization, we're working the other way.
Yeah, if we follow the law in France, Italy, the UK, outside of corruption and things like that, crime is profitable.
So thank you for this segue.
Someone's
Someone's echoing.
Sorry. Turn down over.
Okay, so that was a perfect segue to our next speakers, Jennifer. Are you going to present, or is it going to be Louis?
Sure.
Okay, so Jennifer joined us from NYU. The floor is yours.
So it's a great pleasure to be here, and it's very nice to be following up on the prior paper, because yes, we are looking at related issues. And then let me just, so we start with a policy issue that's important for many countries. So countries around the world are looking at reforming their laws on when corporations and individuals should be criminally liable for corporate misconduct. And the current legal regimes range from everything from countries that basically don't impose criminal liability on organizations at all for their employees' misconduct, to the United States, which imposes it on both organizations and individuals for all crimes committed by individuals in the scope of their employment. And most countries, for example, France, the UK, I don't know the law in Israel, Italy, impose liability on corporations only in very narrow circumstances, and that's being reconsidered. Two academic literatures offer some guidance on this, one explicitly and the other implicitly. So the economic analysis of law, classical deterrence, takes a particular view. Now, I want to emphasize that classical deterrence is not all of economic analysis of law. It's only the narrowest view. But classical deterrence takes the view that the law deters solely through the threat of government-imposed sanctions, and you impose liability on the individual, for example, and if you have enough liability, they will decide that the cost of the crime exceeds the benefit and they won't do it. And that's the only channel in classical deterrence through which the law influences behavior. The other literature is what we refer to as the expressive law literature, that the law influences behavior through its ability to change the social meaning. This literature is related to the literature the prior paper was discussing, which is the law's changing preferences. It's just that Louis and I have a prior paper in the same symposium that they were involved at, in arguing that the law is not changing preferences. It's working through this other channel. And it can change the social meaning by creating an injunctive norm that expresses society's view that the conduct is either just antithetical to good social conduct or immoral, or that society is providing information, Holger raised this, that this conduct is excessively harmful. And either way, this expression of society's view can increase what I think of as the psychological cost of doing this misconduct. People will feel guilt over doing it or shame over doing it, and that could deter. And the strongest claim of this literature, Cass Sunstein and others have made it, is that actually the law could deter at lower social costs by relying primarily on these channels through its ability to just express we shouldn't do it, and wouldn't need to spend all this money trying to catch people and impose sanctions, and certainly not sending people to jail. And that would seem to suggest that, contrary to the classical deterrence view, which has found that both individual and corporate liability are essential to deterrence, this claim would seem to suggest that neither are needed. Now, our paper does a deep dive into, well, does in fact this implication of the strong claim of the expressive law, is this actually right? And is that the right implication for corporate and individual liability? And we argue that it isn't. And we say that the strong claim relies on two implicit assumptions. One is that unenforced laws can actually change the social meaning for individuals and have the kind of effect that people think. And the second is that the law is the central institution for establishing social norms. And we argue that both of those assumptions are incorrect. And once you relax them, then you realize that individual enforcement is essential to the law's ability to deter individuals, and organizational enforcement is also essential. Now, I'm only going to talk about organizational enforcement because I just don't have enough time, I think. So what we do in the paper is to go through what we say are the 5 prerequisites to the law's ability to alter behavior through its expressive channels. And I'm going to focus on the law's ability to deter through establishing a social or injunctive norm. In order to do this, people have to know what the law says. They also have to have this experience that the authority that they deem to be legitimate views this as a social norm. And it's also the psychological literature shows, and Max is one of the leading contributors to this literature, that they also have to have a perception that others around them obey the norm and will disapprove of those who don't. Another very important precondition, and this is something that I view Max as one of the leaders on highlighting this, is it's really important that people do not have a strong personal motive to violate the law. Because when people have a self-interested reason to violate the law, it's going to impact the information they take in about their own conduct. It will distort it in ways that can enable them to violate the law without even necessarily noticing that they are going to cause harm to others or do something the law might discourage. And there's a very rich literature on this that I don't have time to go into. But the key is that personal motivation to do conduct can lead you to be morally blind to what you're doing. Related to this, it's very important that people do not have a countervailing pro-social norm that would justify the conduct. And this is particularly important if they have a self-interested reason to do it. So if there's some other pro-social good that could be achieved through this conduct, then if that interacts with personal motivation, that will just dominate over any message coming out of the law. The fourth thing is, it's not enough for you to know about something in the abstract in advance. At the moment you're making your decision, the law's injunctive norm has to be salient, and it has to be something that's entering into your deliberative process, and you need time to deliberate. And then finally, to the degree to which the expressive norms influence behavior by triggering guilt and shame, then it's important that people perceive themselves to be responsible for the ultimate violation of the norm. They've done an action that's going to cause the violation, but they need to feel responsible for it. And coming out of some work that I did with Stefan Tuntrup on the relationship between shared responsibility and regret, and work that other people have done on shared responsibility and altruism or fairness, there's a considerable amount of evidence that when people can share responsibility for a decision that could otherwise trigger these negative emotions, it mutes that. they're able to decide that they're not somehow responsible. And then our point is that organizations have the ability, and in fact tend to, negate all of these preconditions. And if we're focusing on organizational misconduct, people live their lives within organizations. It is their culture. It's particularly the culture that determines their incentives to do organizational misconduct, and organizations impact all of the preconditions, whether people know what the law requires, perceive it as a norm, have incentives to violate the law, have capacity to deliberate, and feel responsible. So as for the first precondition, organizations control whether employees know of the law. I mean, in some cases, that's not true. For example, law of murder. But if we look at the laws on organizational misconduct, most of those laws you only know about if you learn about it from your employer. It's also the dominant and most local authoritative voice on whether this is something that your authority, the people you look up to, think is an important social norm. So employees are not just going to listen to the voice of the legislature, they're going to look at what the organization is telling them about how important this is. Is this some ridiculous regulation that has no validity, but you have to obey it, but let's try and get around it? Or is the organization telling you that this expresses something that we really ought to be adhering to? And if you think about anti-corruption norms, those were undercut by organizations for decades, where they indicated this was just how business should be done. And even more important, employees tend to look to their immediate managers for their sense of what's important. And the organizations also influence whether an employee's local community, those they see around them, are obeying. Employees figure out what a norm is by the people who are most proximate to them. Are they obeying? And do I think they punish wrongdoers? And the organization, through its influence over compensation, promotion, retention, discipline, culture, can affect whether other employees are violating. In addition, organizations determine employees' incentives to violate the law through their compensation, promotion, and retention policies. Their approach to discipline also does this. They also can provide and regularly do provide competing pro-social justifications. They send intense messages to employees about the importance of serving the firm, promoting the corporate profits, promoting the welfare of your immediate working group. And often the best way to do that is through things like bribery that might enable you to get a sale that you otherwise can't get. And these strongly validated competing pro-social norms combined with personal incentives to violate can wash out the power of the message from the law at the moment the employee is making a choice. And then finally, the organizations can mute the cost to employees. Well, mute the salience of the norm and then mute the cost to the employees of violating it. They can mute the salience of the norm by putting employees under so much time pressure when they're making decisions that they're using automatic processes. They're just focusing on the task they were given, the goal they were set. Make sure our diesel car, comes in under this cost, for example, and they don't focus on the full picture. They just do their task without really thinking about the moral or ethical implications. And organizations can mute the psychological cost of violating the law by spreading out responsibility for the task among so many employees that no employee really feels responsible. You can see this with GM and the ignition switch. None of the employees, it was all spread out so much. And each employee's contribution to GM having cars where if your knee hit your keychain in the ignition switch in a particular way, it shut down your car on the highway. None of the employees involved in that perceive themselves as truly responsible for the deaths that were caused, because they just had a tiny share in the decision-making chain. So we,
your time is almost in.
yes, so I'm at the end. So we say that you cannot deter organizational misconduct unless you provide organizations with a very strong incentive to make sure their employees are not committing crimes. And that means you have to remove the profit, which gives you an argument for organizational liability that imposes fines or otherwise requires disgorgement. And we also want organizations to want to promote the effectiveness of individual liability by being incentivized to detect them and help the government enforce, so that individuals do not expect crime to pay, because when it does, the law's expressive force is muted.
We'll start with Yuval and then move on to Yotam. And would you rather take both questions one after the other, or ready?
That would be great. And I'm just going to take some notes.
Okay, so go ahead.
So thank you, Jacob, for this great paper. I've been working, I guess, I did my PhD on expressive function of the law, and I'm still not sure exactly what it is, but I wanted to focus on this notion of the cost, right? So you mentioned the need for criminal liability and for increased cost for expressive function to work. So one point, I guess, is also related to Eyal's spouse. Daphna has a paper suggesting the reverse, in the sense that actually, I think she focused on the cognitive dissonance or something, but the idea is actually when people freely choose to engage with the law, it's more likely to lead to a more kind of internal change rather than when you threaten. But the second point, I guess, is how exactly then you separate expressive function, or let's say it in a different way. In a sense, when you make so much emphasis on cost, your ability to separate between deterrence and expressive functions becomes trickier, right? Because to some extent, some of the classical expressive law papers were showing this is not related to cost at all, right? People will either coordinate, behave as others, want to be good citizens. I mean, all kind of motivations, which usually the idea was to separate it. But once you give cost such an important role, then you are in a trickier position to justify why it's a separate mechanism.
So that's a very important point. And I guess what I would say is that the core message of our argument, which I think is in line with a conversation that Dan Kahan actually started very early in the literature. He was one of the early contributors, and he made a related point relating to individual liability, is that these are not really complements and separate, they're not really substitutes and separate measures, there's complements. We know that deterrence has limited effectiveness, particularly if the probability of detection is too low. It needs help. And we're saying that particularly when there are strong motivations for individuals to commit the crime and or strong motivations for their organizations to have them commit it, in order to leverage the law's expressive function effectively, you have to impose costs that remove these motivations. But then you get the benefit of both if you do that. So you get both if you use both. But expressive law isn't going to function if crime pays financially, and if organizations have an incentive to undercut its expressive function, is our message.
Right. Don?
Yeah, I agree completely with where you're going with this argument. It's I think essential to an understanding of what this conference has been devoted to. You know, a concern about reifying the organization. You know, it's obvious this conference is meant to bring to bear the polarity between psychology and economics. We don't have a whole lot of voice given to sociology and anthropology, but the lessons there are that, you know, to talk about the organization is foolish. The organization is a set of cultures, a set of social forces, so that we have to climb beyond this notion of the organization says this in response to incentives or biases or whatever it is we're talking about. I was struck by an article that I've cited many times from the organizational behavior literature on the difficulties senior managers often have in communicating to employees throughout the organization that we really don't want you to violate the law. That message gets garbled, and the interpretive communities out there in the field do all sorts of things to defeat its power. It's a famous story about the company understands that regulators are stepping up enforcement in a particular area, so the word goes out, don't do this anymore. And somehow out there in the field, the message is keep doing it, but hide it better. And that gets the company into a large degree of trouble. So I think, you know, I would encourage you to double down on what you're saying, but introduce the sociological take on this, because I think it reinforces everything you say.
That's a wonderful point. And I would be grateful if in a side email you would send me that.
Yeah.
And we do mention the subcultures in our paper, but that actually even emphasizes your point. In other words, we mention it in the paper, and then when we get down to the policy implications, we go back to treating the organization like a black box. And it's clear that we need to say something about those subcultures. And it's sort of, I'm embarrassed that we didn't, because in a lot of the conferences I've been running with my program, like the fall conference we just did, there was a lot of emphasis on the subcultures. So we absolutely should be addressing that in our policy prescriptions, because you can't get anywhere without doing so. And that's spot on.
Yeah, your paper reminded me of Adi Gideon and Holmer's paper from the first day of the conference about loyalty as a source of that encourages, in some instances, wrongdoing by employees. And I think that what both papers sort of highlight is the need for better compliance systems. And we talked about internal whistleblowing mechanisms. So one solution that your paper mentions is having one person in each group that is making decisions that is charged with the responsibility to make sure that the decision complies with the law. What are some other ways that we know are effective to create this change within the organization?
So assuming that you have an organization that's highly motivated, So you're
Yes.
not asking like the policy question that our papers were asking about a compliance?
Right, so you mentioned that the importance of the corporation being sanctioned and liable to create the incentive to create those structures. So what is this change that you would like to see internally?
Well, so the kinds of changes that I tend to focus on, which are more those that enforcement authorities or legislatures can do, as opposed to a lot of the changes that Don, for example, has focused on in his work, or Max, which are compliance changes. I am, for example, a big proponent of enhanced whistleblowing, both protections and bounties. And I think we will get nowhere until we have much more effective whistleblowing programs, because right now you can provide corporations with all the incentives to self-report you want, as I'm trying to do in my ALI enforcement guidelines that just got adopted Monday. So I just have to give you a shout out for my ALI enforcement guidelines. But as long as corporations basically know that their misconduct won't be detected, they're not going to self-report. You need whistleblowing programs, and those need bounties. And as far as I know, we're basically the only country offering bounties, and our bounties aren't all that effective, except for over in one area, healthcare fraud, where we have a key Tom provision. So you need other channels of getting misconduct to light. You need legislatures to be willing to provide resources to enforcement. I mean, one of the great sort of political economy stories is legislatures love to adopt tough laws, and then they intentionally underfund enforcement. And they know full well what they're doing, because there's no profit, there's no budgetary justification for underfunding enforcement, particularly something like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Every prosecutor you add is a moneymaker for the government because there's so much corruption. They underfund, same with IRS, right? They underfund tax enforcement too. So I focus on those type of mechanisms within the firm. Actually, internal reporting is very important, but you need mechanisms for communicating that information back to employees. You need to be changing cultures, and you need employees to be hearing stories of people who, one, reported and got rewarded for it, but two, other employees who crossed the line or who look the other way when employees cross the line and were sanctioned for it. You need to be changing the culture. And you also need to be changing internal promotion and retention policies. And, you know, I can best analogize this to academics, right? We're all told that there's a huge number of metrics we're measured on, you know, teaching and our contribution to the community and scholarship, et cetera. But most, for example, untenured academics in the US at least know that actually at the end of the day, there's one metric that's actually going to matter, which is their publications. And the other metrics don't matter as much at all. And people understand that. And that's true in many corporations. They're told compliance matters, but the employees who win are the ones who do well. And then the final thing that's something I've been pushing a lot in our conferences is, if you want to change the culture within the firm, you have to signal that ethical conduct generally matters. And that means that compliance has to be getting and using data coming out of HR on all, including unsubstantiated allegations of sexual harassment and discrimination. Compliance tends to just focus on legal violations, but compliance needs to know who are the less ethically inclined employees, and certain types of customer reports, customer complaints that are more fraud related, and sexual harassment and discrimination are great red flags of someone who's a line crosser. And Eugene Soltis at Harvard is doing some work trying to show empirically that this is the case, that it's a very good predictor of who's going to cross the line in other ways. And there has to be much more integration of those kind of ethical norms into what compliance is focusing on. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's.
Yes, thank you so much. And I think that the next paper sort of brings a different perspective in a way, also about how in some of the indirect ways corporations are experiencing pressure and change, this time not by the law, but by activists who are pushing people within the firm to on some ethical buttons. So our next speaker is going to be Mary, comes from Penn. Take the floor.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to be here with you. I'm May Mcdonnell. I'm a political sociologist. I study non-market strategy at Wharton. Let me share my screen and I'll get started. All right, so yeah, this has been really interesting to listen to. I started my career as a law professor, and so it's fun to kind of revisit that. But I moved to study social movements as something of an informal regulatory mechanism. These are, social movements that mobilize and target firms directly with things like protests and boycotts and try to coerce firms to comply with a reform agenda. Social movements, the literature in our field shows are a really important critical mechanism of corporate social change. So oftentimes social movements present signals to firms about how society's ideals and norms are changing. And movements can also start to inform markets. So insofar as movements can ultimately shape the way that, those who participate in financial markets think about social and environmental risk, they can, change the way that ethical behaviors affect a firm's ongoing performance. And so they're a really important mechanism. The traditional question in sociology and the sociology of social movements has always been, why do firms ever listen to social movements that come and speak to them directly? Social movements are typically populated by marginalized, relatively powerless stakeholders. But the movement literature suggests they have a fairly high success rate. So 30 years ago, about 25% of boycotts received a response from the firms that they targeted, for example. If you look now, boycotts that receive major media attention are more likely to receive around 40% of a positive response. So movements are gaining power. And the literature has suggested that the primary reason that that movements succeed is through disruption. Although movements are made up of marginalized stakeholders, what they're doing is using media channels to problematize a corporate behavior, to try to disrupt a firm's relationships with the stakeholders that are more core and more powerful. And so insofar as movements can cause this disruption, they're more likely to get the attention and positive response of corporate insiders. So there's a lot of literature to show this, just to go over a few of the main ones here. There's work that shows that contentious activism alters consumer preferences. It can move consumers toward substituting products or even substituting moral markets like the organics food industry instead of mainstream food. They can increase shareholder divestment. They can increase regulatory scrutiny, slow the amount of time that firms need to get regulatory approval, and they can reduce access to political stakeholders. So they make it less easy for a firm to positively shape the regulatory environment. That said, there's been very little attention to how social movements disrupt or affect a firm's relationship with its own leaders. And I thought this was really surprising because when you talk to activists in the field, they oftentimes suggest that the leaders are the ones they're really talking to when they're coming with a protest or a boycott movement. So this is just a quote from an interview with an international executive of a large environmental NGO. And he said, we try to appeal to, I don't want to say a company's better instincts because I don't think companies have them, but the leaders within that company to appeal to their better instincts. If you serve the companies we're targeting, you've created a narrative for yourself about why you're there and what you do. And it is super jarring for some of these folks to see their company's name in the press associated with something. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. So he suggested what they're trying to do is problematize the behavior to leaders themselves to appeal to their own moral instincts and then to have them change the way that the firm is behaving. So the research question for this particular paper is, how do activist challenges affect the loyalty of a firm's elite decision makers? Just to run through the core argument really quickly, to try to understand this question, when we went to the more micro organizational behavior literature on employee motivation, there's been an awful lot done there about how employees' perceptions of their firm's social responsibility affect their motivation to serve. So for example, there's work that suggests that corporate social responsibility or pro-social signals facilitate recruitment, they make people more loyal, they make people willing to work for less money, and they make people work harder and more ethically. So if we distill this large body of literature into some rules we can work with, it suggests that pro-social cues increase member identification with an organization and hence their loyalty, so it's motivating. And antisocial cues, if they think the firm believes in values that they do not share, this can provoke an identity threat for the people within the firm and prompt their exit. So activist challenges are trying to promulgate cues about corporate social responsibility. But the really interesting thing about activism is that typically the issues at the heart of social movements are still very politically contested. So activists, you'll have social movements mounting on either side of the ideological spectrum on an issue. And you might have social movements trying to press organizations to reform in some way, but an opposing social movement, a counter movement, if you will, rallying to press organization to adopt the opposite way. And so these are politically contested issues. And what a movement is saying might be taken by you as an employee as a signal that the firm is pro-social or anti-social, depending on your own ideological orientation and how it matches that of the social activists that are challenging the firm. So different people might perceive the same social movement as a cue that their firm is normatively appropriate or objectionable, depending on their own personal ideological orientation. And so putting this all together, what it suggests is that whether a given activist challenge will provoke exit or loyalty among a firm's insiders depends on how it aligns with each particular insider's own ideological orientation. So two main propositions, and then I'm going to jump into the data for how we tried to test this out in the field. So one proposition is that when a social movement is ideologically aligned with a given insider, a given employee or leader of a firm, what the activist claims are doing is highlighting inconsistencies between the firm's values and that individual's values. And we think that this should trigger an identity threat and incentivize exit. So we should see turnover in that case. In cases where there's opposition, ideological opposition, where a movement is aligned with the opposing ideology of a given member, so say the member is conservative and the movement is a progressive movement, the activist claims are actually inadvertently highlighting a congruity between the firm's actions and the values of that member, and which we think can strengthen identification and disincentivize exit. So movements may, in fact, entrench the opposition in a way by, illustrating to that member that the firm is congruent with them and rallying that member to support their firm because the firm's being attacked for being congruent with them. So the hypothesis here is that the likelihood that an internal stakeholder will exit after an activist challenge increases with the alignment of his or her personal political ideology and that of the activists. And then we also explore the difference between different types of ideologies and the way we should see this manifest. And in particular, there's a literature in political psychology called the rigidity of the right, which suggests that as compared to liberal ideologies, conservatives tend to be more prone to entrenchment when they're threatened. And so what we suggest is that identification and loyalty mechanism I discussed will be stronger for conservatives that are attacked by liberal movements as compared to liberals whose firms are attacked by conservative movements. So as compared to liberals, conservatives will display a stronger tendency toward increased loyalty and entrenchment in the face of social movement challenges from the opposition. So just to dive into the context here, and I'm going to go really quickly over kind of what we've done and what results we see. We're going to explore this by looking at corporate board turnover in the wake of activist boycotts. And we did this by creating a sample of 120 boycotts against companies that received major media attention between 2000 and 2014. And we started by just doing a validity check. Are boycotts the kind of things that drive board turnover? There's a lot of work in corporate governance that suggests you see board turnover after negative events, but are boycotts that kind of negative event? So just as a validity check, we put together a difference in difference analysis at the firm level, looking at board turnover in firms that are targeted by boycotts compared to those that are not. And we do, in fact, see that boycotted firms experience significantly higher turnover in the wake of a boycott compared to control firms. But our hypotheses have to be explored at the director level of analysis. So looking at a given member's ideology and how it maps onto an attacking movement. So to look at this, we're going to examine a sample of around 1,200 directors that sat on the boards of these firms attacked by boycotts. And our dependent variable is a 0-1 variable. If they turned over, if they left their seat at the expiration of their term. And we tried to limit this to voluntary departures by actually going into media archives and culling all of those director turnover events that we could attribute to something other than voluntary departure. We then coded a boycott's ideology and each director's ideology. So just to quickly run through how we did that, we had former lobbyists read each of the articles about boycotts and code them as either progressive, neutral or unclassifiable, and conservative. And then we went into the FEC archives here in the US to look at each director's personal political contributions, so that we could code them as more or less aligned with conservative or progressive ideologies. And this is just the distribution of what we see. But you see there's -1 corresponds with a director that gives only Republican contributions in the US. 1 is director that gives only Democratic contributions. And we see a healthy representation on either end of the spectrum. So we're going to test our hypotheses by interacting that boycott ideology and director ideology in a logit regression to see if alignment between the orientation of activists and directors provokes exit. And the models are complicated. We have lots of controls, but given the time, I'm not going to go into it. I think it's best if I show you the results as a picture. So this is models predicting voluntary exit after a boycott. And what we see is that among liberal directors are significantly more likely to leave after liberal boycotts than after conservative boycotts. And we also see a significant effect across ideology after conservative boycotts, where conservative directors are more likely to leave after conservative boycotts than liberal directors. We showed that this effect is true if you just look at liberals or just look at conservatives instead of treating them as a continuum. And in auxiliary analyses to examine the mechanisms, what we find here that's important is that,
3 minutes.
Say it again?
3 minutes.
Great, thanks. What we find here that's important is that the identification mechanism is in fact stronger for conservatives. So when we look at departure in the realm of ideologically alignment, when you're challenged by a movement who you sympathize with, we only see liberals being significantly more likely to leave. But when we look at exit in response to ideological opposition, we see conservatives being significantly more likely to leave than liberals. So when you are confronted by a movement who you are opposed to, conservatives are in fact more likely to entrench and become more loyal. And we don't see that same effect emerging for liberals. So just to go over the primary findings and contributions here, the bottom line is that the effect of an activist challenge on board turnover, we would expect to see the same across leaders of a firm outside of the board. It depends on how the challenge resonates with a given member's personal values. For corporate governance, this project shows that directors care about social performance, and directors like to see an alignment between the firms that they serve and their own values in the same way as other research suggests that lower level employees do. For social movement research, it suggests that activism can disrupt a firm's relationship with internal stakeholders, with internal leaders. So when we try to understand why activism receives a positive corporate response, it's not just because of external stakeholders pressuring the firm, it's also because it's affecting the loyalties of a firm's internal leadership. The project highlights the importance of attending to ideological diversity. I think work exploring social activism in general tends to assume that activism is progressive, but that's not true. We see an awful lot of ideological diversity in activism and an increasing amount of ideological diversity. In the US, for example, post Trump's election, we saw a veritable explosion of conservative social movements that target firms. So that is an active part of the movement field today. And I think one of the most interesting things about the project is that it suggests that activism may inadvertently entrench the opposition, especially when it's progressive activism, insofar as it might drive out progressive allies within the firm and entrench conservative members who become more loyal to the firm. So that is the paper, and I can end there and take any questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I see that Kobe already raised his hand. Kobe?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you. It's a great paper, very interesting. My question is, have you had a chance to speak with some of those directors and just to double check that they indeed left because of those boycotts? Because my sense, I mean, obviously you run very fast on the control variables, but there are many things that may going on. People may leave. I mean, if you control it within firms, because some directors may leave because, after a boycott, there is a decline in the share price. It depends when the tenure is right after the boycott, or if the end of the tenure, if it's staggered both 3 years or 2 years after the boycott, and then there is enough time for the company to recover. So there are a lot of things that may going on over there. And maybe if you feel like this is the strong, motivation behind leaving, pick like 10 directors, 20 directors, they're already gone, and, confirm that this was the case.
Yeah, it's really hard to get directors to talk about things like this. So we have not had much luck interviewing directors directly. So we're having to kind of get at potential competing explanations through control variables. And you're absolutely right. We go through a huge battery of robustness tests to get at these. And for example, we can show that the likelihood of departure is stronger when the term ends closer to the boycott. So just what you said there. But so the robustness checks support the story instead of detracting from it.
Yeah, my question was quite similar to Kobe's, but I understand that they probably sign a non-disclosure agreement that makes it complicated to collect the qualitative data. But I was wondering if you can share like a story, a very illustrating example of a boycott and some of the people behind the scene that can demonstrate what the numbers show.
Yeah, I don't have kind of a vivid example that comes to mind. There's one of the boycotts in the sample where Target Corporation had made a covert contribution to a 501c6 that supported a gubernatorial candidate that was anti-gay marriage. And Target has been a big supporter of the LGBTQ movement here in the US. And so that was a really vivid boycott that you saw a lot of kind of polarized opposition around. And And so, the argument is that if you're a conservative director that, targets position and supporting that gubernatorial candidate, it aligns with your own ideology. So you're going to be loyal to the firm, whereas it's going to be really problematic to you if you are a liberal director. But yeah, since we can't talk to the directors themselves, it's really hard for me to, share with you what I think you want me to be able to say here. Hajin?
Yeah, this is super fascinating, and I really like the study. So thank you so much for sharing. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts. I imagine this is even harder to get because you can't really talk to directors. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the effect of voice as opposed to exit, because I could imagine if I'm a director. The directors have just so much power in the company, right? So if you're really mad that your company is doing something that you disagree with, you might, instead of leaving, try to change from within.
Yeah. And so this is actually another thing that we tried to get at with the robustness checks that I didn't show you. But there's about 40% of the firms in the sample that have an explicit social policy committee or a corporate social responsibility committee. And so the directors that serve on that committee would arguably have more of a direct say in how the firm responded. And we do find that the exit results are lower for those directors that have more of a kind of a direct control over the firm's response. They're also lower for the CEO, given that the CEO can typically has the loudest voice in determining how a firm responds to social crises.
So I was wondering if maybe for a future project, it would be interesting to see the next career move of the departing directors, to see whether or not they can find a new job in a different corporation that aligns better with their own. And what would be the implications for someone who have been targeted and haven't or decided to keep the job? So I'm just wondering, in a sense, what are the labor market implications of choosing to depart or not to do so?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I have a working paper that just shows that a firm's social or ESG performance is related to a director's performance in the director marketplace. Which sort of gets at this indirectly, but I think what you're asking is even more interesting. If you're at a firm that is, attacked by a conservative movement and you stay, does that affect your likelihood of also being invited over to firms that are more progressive leaning? I think that that's a really important question because there's a lot of work right now showing that stigma spills over through board linkages. And so, the firms would have a rational reason to not want to have someone on the board who had a foot in another corporation whose values were so misaligned with their own, because they could be dragged in to contentious crises and painted with the same brush if that firm was dragged into another social movement challenge.
Yeah, well, I look forward to read your future paper. The spillover effect is really interesting. Adi?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mary, for a very interesting presentation. This connects to the conversation we had yesterday regarding like in Michal's presentation regarding ESG, which she pointed like the millennial effects, and the question is what exactly happened, right, in this generation? Did really preferences change? And when I talked, so Michal argues that this is, I think, right, more preference changed, and our own argued, and he said in literature, the sociological literature, he said there's less evidence for preference change, but he says what really happens, and I think your paper really fits very nicely into this. He says that really preferences are pretty much stable. Like when you look in all the demographic, regarding environmental preferences, but what really happened is how coalesced. People coalesce like into communities. That means instead of having it diverse in this US, similar minds, and your mechanism exactly also exacerbates as another dimension in which you see this effect, right? Because you have a Republican company, and really these activists, what they do, they reinforce this effect that the red companies are really red and the blue companies are really blue as other dimensions, that how the social media has this effect of making these communities and making And that's why he says that there's no more polarization. I think you're more familiar with this literature than I am. There's no more polarization, but the reason why because these communities act as echo chambers. So exactly, we have a fully red company and a fully blue company, and your dynamic exactly explains how it happens. So would you agree with like the placing of and the context that I'm putting in your study, or they have it all wrong?
Definitely. I think it's almost tribalism what we're seeing happening here, right? And that you're getting firms are being pressured to commit to their tribe and to be a pure member. I think that to really get at whether your intuition is true, we'd have to look and see if the turnover is then met with ideologically skewed recruitment. So if it's true that after you see a flight of liberals, it's also less likely that liberals are going to be recruited and replace those outgoing members. That would not surprise me. And so I do think that over time, you would probably be likely to see firms that have populations of insiders that skew more and more in one or the other ideological direction.
I saw that Michal raised her hand, and Yuval is also waiting, and Cobb. So maybe we should listen to all three questions, and then you'll have a chance to comment on all three of them.
Right. So first, I'll say I need to explain myself. I think that what we think is that there's not necessarily a change of preference, but at least the managers believe that the young generation's preference affect their consumption decisions, employment decisions, and investment decisions, which was also reflected in the paper that Cobb presented yesterday, that it affects those dimensions more among young people. But I'll say two things that also support the polarization story. So I think that the polarization will continue if also the older generation, which is more right oriented, will start to use money combine ideology with consumption and employment and investment decisions. And I think we haven't seen it that much. Also in the Cobb's paper, they behave differently in that sense. But now there's from yesterday Wall Street Journal article that there are some now attacks from the right on CEOs, which is kind of relatively new. So I think that's supported. The other thing that was surprising to me to see is that there's so many liberal directors in like the distribution. There are more liberal directors than conservative directors. I thought
well, they're very educated, and we see a really pronounced correlation between education and liberalism. So I think that's part of what's going on. But I think it oftentimes surprises people how liberal corporate boards are.
Liberal directors? Do you think that's right?
Sure.
Okay. Not on Wall Street, probably. But anyway.
Some of the law and economics professors are actually liberals.
Yes, of course, but they're not directors, but they're not invited to be directors in most cases.
First of all, because of the diversity movement.
Now, okay, but
no, it's not just now. It's like for the last 10 or 15 years, there's a push for diversity. So probably almost all the diverse candidates who are being put on boards are liberal. And you probably started with a mix of people who are like half and half, if it reflects like the US population. So you start with like a mix of the US population, which is half and half. Then you diversify, and all the people who are coming on as diversity candidates are liberal. So you would expect there to be like more liberal directed.
Half and half. But anyway, I was surprised to see. Which years is this from? Your data? Mine?
No. I mean, I don't think that the diversity movement has made too much traction in the US right now.
Yeah, there's so little diversity on corporate boards in the US that can't be the explanation.
We have one last minute and 2 questions. So let's take Yuval's and Cobb's. And even though the diversity issue is fascinating, it kind of goes upward.
So my question is, I guess everyone from was outside the US to submit a paper always have these questions. Okay, what's unique about Israel, right? So people from the US never get these questions from editor. Why did you focus on the US? Because it's the US. But I'm still going to ask. To what extent do you think it's a universal thing or a US thing? Because in many aspects, right? The environment, science, COVID, in so many topics, you see this, kind of the fight between conservatives and liberal in the US.
Yeah.
Seems to be, I mean, I might be wrong, but seems to be unique in the,
Yeah.
I don't think we have like a right versus left debate about the environment or about science in Israel, maybe in other countries, I don't know. But so to what extent would you describe as an American phenomenon or a universal one in your perspective?
Yeah, I think it is I think the mechanisms are a universal phenomenon. And I say that with confidence because so much of that literature in OB on motivation is done in other contexts. The fact that we can study it with precision, it makes it much easier to do in the field in the US because we have a two-party polarized system and because we have a regulated disclosure over personal contribution. So we can actually, get a systematic proxy for directors' ideological orientation and, get it alignment fairly cleanly. But even in the US context, I think in some ways we're biased against seeing what we see because most of the conservative leaning directors on public company boards are going to be more of Wall Street Republicans, but most of the conservative issues that are brought by social activists in the field are, social conservative issues. And so, we have a lot more libertarian leaning really directors who you wouldn't necessarily expect to be to fall into the patterns that we see, but it is more complicated here than even I think I let on.
Mary, thank you so much. Kobe, would you forgive me for not leaving you?
Yeah. I just wanted to mention, she also already asked a question. I'll send you an email. It's a suggestion of something you can do with the data, but go to your coffee break. I won't hold you from Tel Aviv, so that's fine.
Thank you all. Thank all of our presenters.
Thank you.